Okay, so the idea of this talk is to provide a link between what Steve Gibson has said about the sort of policy interests of DEFRA and some of the questions we're interested in, to think much more about the modelling needs and how we can work together. And this working together, I think, is really important, because what I want to do is to start by looking at the methodological and policy-centred questions that we voted on at the first workshop, where we had to vote on the first or top 3 questions that we were interested in. And on the left, you have how we voted within this workshop on these questions, and we had a sample size of 40, which included researchers and some policy people. But then Victoria kindly sent this out to various people within DEFRA, Natural England, Forestry Commission, Environment Agency, and asked them to do the same, to vote for their top 3 questions. And as you can see, there is some match about developing better insight into human-environment relationships, which is good, and how maths and stats can help combine different data sets that have different characteristics. But we also have this one about creating models to learn to inform flexible policies being important on this side, but not amongst the researchers. And if we have a look at the policy-centred questions, then we find that again there is some match in terms of the uncertainty bounds around the impact of a given decision making, of interest to researchers and to the sort of policy decision maker community. But we also find there are ones which were quite valued in this small sample of 18 about defining and modelling the baseline against which to measure particular policy impacts was important in this community but not in this. Now obviously those are small sample sizes, but I think it's interesting as it reflects the need to work together, because we are possibly interested in slightly different questions. And so I think that's a really good argument for sort of the idea of co-creation. But that was just a little bit of background interest, I think. So what I really want to focus on in this talk is, what are DEFRA's modelling needs? Steve has already touched on this in the slide which I said I had taken out of my talk. But it's about having this policy-focused modelling capability, and one that integrates across not just the biophysical aspects of the landscape, which perhaps many people in this room are used to dealing with, but one that also integrates the social, the human dimension and the economics. And in the discussions I've been with in a short time within DEFRA, there are sort of a number of things that have come up as of being of interest, and it's quite good that these have been reflected in the talks that I've heard, both at the opening workshop and at the closing workshop, and Steve's talked about. So issues around scale, and that's both spatial and temporal, the fact that different policies play out at different scales, and so also many of the policies are of interest at different scales. So within one policy, different scales are often of interest. So we might need to think of some sort of nesting of models. We've heard about actors, and this is not just about those who manage the land or own the land, but increasingly I think we've heard about the need to engage with communities and with individuals, that we are part of that decision-making process nowadays. Place is obviously incredibly important in the context of something like the environmental land management strategy, what works where and when, and we need to think about the multifunctionality of landscape and, as I said, the socio and economic and political underpinnings. Now none of that's probably very new to you, but again I think it's useful to see where we are sort of talking or thinking about the same things. So I've got 3 slides now on sort of modelling for improved landscape decision making from a DEFRA perspective, and these are ones that are being sort of collated through discussions across different teams within DEFRA. Data obviously is fundamental to our models, and it's recognised that within DEFRA we have a lot of evidence, some of it sitting in Steve's team, and they're obviously developing evidence, but also as researchers we sometimes hold data, or sometimes DEFRA has data that we can use. So I think there are questions we can look at as to how do we use our data resources effectively to improve models, and particularly I think it'd be helpful to see how some of the data we hold within DEFRA that is available could be used. And something we've touched on within this workshop is around common parameterization and driving of models, so we have this more uniformed approach, and again the sort of bringing together of data sets from different communities. So perhaps what might be sort of helpful is, you know, what data do we have, where is our knowledge strong, and perhaps where is it quality lacking, or where is it quite patchy, so we know what data can be used to inform decision making. The second thing is around process understanding. We know it's a crowded space. We've seen that in terms of this workshop, and you represent probably only the tip of an iceberg in terms of modelers doing different things. And again, we've touched on the uncertainty, conflicts in outputs, and the fact that models are often designed to work in particular places under particular circumstances. So what is interest in the policy context perhaps is what works where, and what are the things we really do need to get right if we're going to make well-informed policy decisions. And this is obviously within the context of a very dynamic landscape. So understanding what are some of the big strategic drivers, not just individually. We've heard a lot about climate models and climate change, not surprisingly given some of the people in this room, and I have nothing against climate change, but also looking at the effects of combined drivers. So it's not just about things that drive the biophysical system, but we've heard about things that will be big drivers in terms of behaviour. So sort of changes in plastics, use of resources and wastes, for example. And so we need to understand, you know, how different drivers will interact, as well as how different policies could interact. And in terms of making that decision, I mean, it's been quite clearly said that we would not end up using the models to make the decision, but to inform the decision. And there are a number of decision support tools out there, and I think very often it's a question of how these support tools can be made in a way that can be used to inform policy. And this is again where I think talking with the end users is very important, so that they can be perhaps redesigned in a way that can help to inform some of the questions that we have, or some of the questions we don't yet know that we have, but that might be out there. And so the question is how do we bring together the data, bring together the outputs from the models to see how we can use what you're coming up with to inform our decision making. So those are just some of the things that have been highlighted about from some of the teams within DEFRA. But the other thing is that the systems program has been mentioned, and obviously we are interested as well in some of the same questions. We're not going to be coming at it from a very mathematical, certainly not novel mathematical view, but one of the things that we feel we need to try and think about is this big overarching question that we've set ourselves, because in reality landscape decision makers need to take multiple policies into account, hopefully such that the policies are coherent and produce coherent outcomes. And perhaps to do this we'll need to start from a single policy to understand its operation and what some of the possible outcomes might be, before perhaps building in other policies and their interactions. So something like net zero has already been mentioned by Steve. That is obviously a very wide-ranging policy that will affect land use and will affect habitats in the way that Steve outlined, but it is a very multidimensional problem that involves a great number of actors, not just within the landscape community. But if you looked at Steve's slide in detail, it mentioned things like sort of aviation and energy usage. So there's a need for a really wide engagement on that if we are going to address the landscape decision, the landscape decisions that need to be made around achieving net zero. So if we're going to try and address the systems question, I think we need to try and break it down, first of all, in what are our desired societal, or possibly what are our desired policy outcomes, and how do we find out about these, because we all have different views. And if you saw when net zero was announced, Theresa May also said that there would be these sort of citizen science, these sort of climate assemblies, and certainly we have one in Oxford in September, who will start to try and work out how the net zero might play out within Oxfordshire, including how it might play out in the landscape as a whole and with its implications for biodiversity. Also, if you're approaching this multifunctionality from a systems perspective, which is obviously the most sensible way to go, then it's very helpful to have a look at perhaps what are some of the outcomes we might want and what are the different ways of achieving those outcomes. So what particular policy interventions might produce that desired outcome. And maybe we don't look for a particular target, as been said, but we look at a scatter of outcomes around that desired target. We also need to be able to understand the multiple outcomes of specific policy interventions. So we need to understand the synergies and trade-offs between interventions which may result from particular policies. And as I said earlier, we also need to understand the impacts of specific pressures as well as multiple pressures. There's an awful lot that's of interest there to DEFRA, which I think you've started to address a number of those things during the course of this workshop. And just to close, because I am a geographer, if you've got a word that says map in it, I think of a map, and possibly because I've been doing so much travelling to London at the moment, the tube map came to mind. And here we have the policy, not cycle, the policy circle, represented by the yellow line. And if you think of the other tube lines as representing perhaps different policy interventions, you'll see that they all intersect the policy circle at different points. And we know there are different points of leverage that we've been talking about and Peter mentioned earlier. And so you have all these different lines, we have these different policies, we have different interventions we can make, perhaps represented by the stations. We have perhaps some desired outcomes represented by the ends of the line. I was delighted to hear Cockfosters mentioned this morning because that's where I grew up. So I was very grateful for Cockfosters having been built, even if it was way out in the countryside then. It wasn't when I was there. And also, if you look at some of these stations, there are different routes to getting to them. So there may be different actions that we can take to get to different points. And as you know, there is obviously a spatial and temporal dimension to this. And there may be hiccups on the way. But for me, this just gives you an idea, I think, of the complexity. But there are options there. And we need to think how we can best travel from where we are to where we want to be. Thank you. Peter?
Thank you very much for that, Pam. I'm quite sure how much time we have. So
I think I've had my time.
Let's move to Peter first, and then
you can see if you can leave me some time. You keep the time, then I'll answer some
That's right. Keep your questions for Pam, definitely.
there will be facilitated discussion and next steps. Who's facilitating?
I think you might be, Felix.
All right, so
It might be Jane, you never know, probably will be Jane.
well, you two can lead the facilitated discussion.
Okay, splendid, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, how do we get the other one? Okay folks, sorry it's me again, but it's not going to be very much of me. We're going to try a series of shotgun presentations from people that developed project ideas that actually went into the call, but it doesn't really matter. It's not a pitch. It's not a pitch to you, Duncan, or anyone else. It's actually just to show you the ideas that have come out. Many more ideas that could be funded with the current money. That's the only thing I would say. Right, so this is a roadmap.
I was hoping to hear something original.
You will get original stuff, but not from me. Research roadmap ideas emerging for the programme. So basically the people, and one of them, Bill Cooning's had to go because of the taxi, so James is going to stand in for him. So some people are having to present slides very short notice, which is great, because we're a good team. So I just want to say a bit about this, the nature of this programme, which was innovative actually for Newton Institute, I think. Not just because it's short, but because it was connected to a funding call. And the organisers, I think, were quite concerned this might destroy the normal openness that you get in a Newton Institute programme. It didn't. And that's because people really engaged in it in a very open way and thought, you know, we'd like the money, but it's not really what this is about. So actually what it did is that focused minds. So that's what we want to get across here. But also, and thanks to everyone else who was involved in the programme, by the way. So the problem we've got really is that this is probably Pam here, and that's me. We basically trying to bridge a gap from either side, not really knowing whether they join up at the moment. And we know a bit about what each wants, but I sort of actually deliberately didn't look at your presentation so that I wouldn't be affected, which is a strange way of viewing it. It's not really co-design, but I wanted to get this idea. I wanted to get this idea that we might find that we're actually got similar interests. And I think we will. Anyway, that's the point. But the other thing, of course, is that if you're not quite sure what the target is, it's quite good to have a shotgun, because the pellets go everywhere and you'll hit something, and that's basically what the next people going to speak are the pellets, right? We might hit one or more of the things you've put up as a priority, and if we haven't, we'll get a better gun next time. Right, so we're going to hear from eight separate proposals for 2 minutes. If this doesn't finish you off at the end of the day, nothing will. And we're going to start with Stephen, I think.
Yeah.
Oh no, first of all, so these are the ideas. If you go upstairs, they're still up there, written on the board. It says please leave, we might need to take that away. You can't read them here, so we're going to give you just a synopsis of the ideas that come out. This is about the range of ideas that have been developed in this, yeah.
Peter, remember to give people the mic.
Oh yes.
Give the whole thing. Just don't clip it on, we'll just give it to them like we did before.
Right, so unwind it and then that's very good, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go through these and we will start with Stephen and I will unclip. And 2 minutes each, please, folks. Next up is James, actually.
Thanks.
So if we line up like school kids.
So thanks, Peter. So this project is about developing new mathematics for describing the kinds of agent-based models which are used in landscape-scale decisions. And I must say, I was a little bit disappointed in Pam's talk to hear that apparently theory for agent-based models has no interest at all from the from the stakeholder side. Agent-based models are a very good way of representing the fact that the decisions about individual changes in landscapes are made by humans, by individual humans who don't do what they're told. They have their own reasons for making their decisions. They might or might not make them according to what we might call rationality. But these models are very complex. They contain individuals which make decisions with some kind of randomness. They interact with their environment, both biotic and abiotic. And they are usually simulated by computer because they're thought to be too complex to do any maths for them. And I won't go into the reasons for why that's the case. But this project arose from the fact that recently I and a colleague called Otto Overskainen in Helsinki have developed a way for analysing the kinds of so-called individual-based models which are used in ecology, which essentially solves some of those problems for analysing agent-based models. And so the idea is to extend this framework to include the kinds of human agents which make decisions. So there are many ways in which these are similar, but there are some technical details which would need to be extended. The point is that we have a general representation of this model, and what that means is that we can do some derivations directly on the general model, which means that any specific model can then be, we can derive the equations for that using computer algebra. So there's a one big horrible bit of maths that has to be done, but it only needs to be done once. So what this gives you, in tandem with what you can do from simulations, is first of all you have an approximate description of your model, which you can use to explore scenarios and possibilities very rapidly. And in some cases, on very simple landscapes, you might be able to solve them semi-analytically or analytically to get some more understanding and get general principles from your models. But also on real landscapes, the benefit of having a mathematical description is that you can do some analysis which gives you a relationship between the things which you are interested in, the direct outputs of your model, and the inputs of your model. So you can, for example, you can calculate directly an expression for the sensitivity of the outputs to your inputs, rather than having to vary the inputs and then measure the outputs. You can calculate that thing directly. So this can be a much more efficient way of calculating error propagation or sensitivity or model fitting, or dare I even say optimization. And we will, sorry, that's my two minutes up.
I think yes.
Okay, so there's a case study which is on agriculture biodiversity enhancement schemes. I have no time, so I'll just let you read about that.
I think when you're keeping shotguns shotty, I'm going to give people a proper 2-minute timer, so beep in an normal
You've spoiled it for all of us, Steve.
Yours is animated. You might.
Bloody hell. So Bill's buggered off without telling me about this. I was sitting next to him, and then Peter came and said, "Oh, you're giving this talk," and I said, "What talk?" Anyway, this is the talk. So Bill, I think in the first workshop, Bill Coonan, I'm James Bullock, by the way, presented a method or a series of methods for upscaling biodiversity. What does that mean? That often you have data on a range of surveys in a region or across a country, and you may want to know what are the total number of species of plant or mammals or bees in that country or region. And there are a number of methods which Bill tested in a nice paper he published last year, which I just speed read in 2 minutes, to be able to do that, and some of them are very effective. So that answers a sort of big scientific need. How do you go from small-scale surveys to what the whole biodiversity of a region is, the gamma diversity, the number of species? And often that's done, as Bill's put here, by various proxies. And one particular issue is agri-environment schemes. We go and put wildflower margins in fields or restore grasslands or whatever, and we can go and measure what effect that has on local species. We go and do bee surveys or plant quadrats, and so we know locally what effect that's had on the alpha diversity, the biodiversity of that little spot. We do it across a farm. We assume that's increasing diversity across the farm in some way. When we do it across a number of farms, we assume the biodiversity across that region is being increased. But it's very hard to go from those point surveys or the circle surveys to the diversity in the region. So Bill's idea is to use these approaches to scale up from these small scale actions, agri-environment actions, to look what the overall gamma diversity, the total species number, would be. And specifically from a policy perspective, if you put in a particular margin somewhere, what effect will that have on the gamma diversity of the region? If you put in 3 or 4, what effect will that have? So that's the idea, and don't ask me any questions because that's all I know.
Well, this is a project in discussion on cost effectiveness, portfolio testing, and decision support for flood mitigation and uncertainty. So very briefly, the objectives all regarding flood mitigation are concretely to establish a GitHub site to test and disseminate a graphical squarely cost effectiveness tool for all stakeholders, the public, anyone who's interested to use it. Second objective is to generalize and optimize the cost effective tool under more uncertainty. For example, spatial temporal rainfall and spatial temporal flood mitigation measures. And the third goal is about developing decision support tools based on gamification. So what's this square lake analysis? Say you have a flood excess volume for a particular flood, which is 3.35 million cubic meters. Divide that by 2 meters, that's this high, then you get a square lake of 1294 by 1294 meters. That's the flood volume, the excess volume you want to mitigate against so that you have no damage. You partition that with the colors amongst the different flood mitigation measures for a specific scenario. I have a whole range of scenarios using Peter's range of optimal scenarios for your decision making. This is just one of them. Could be higher walls, the cost for the higher walls, cost per percentage for every mitigation measure. Giving room to the river GRR is certain, but floodplain storage, NFM, natural flood management, and beavers is uncertain. In the bottom, it just is the worst case where the 3 measures fit the whole square lake, but natural flood management and beavers and a little bit of floodplain storage is used for extra mitigation against climate change effects. Notice that natural flood management and beavers are tiny slivers. In all the cases I've seen, that's the case. The beavers is very small. These comprise 33 beaver colonies. With that?
Just keep going.
Okay. So the gamification involves, for example, using the climate wedges. Fossil fuel emission, you want to keep that at 7, and there's a game where when you don't use climate change mitigation, you want to cut down these wedges, and there's a game based on these wedges, and you see the visual comparison. So these wedges can be used for this flood mitigation case. So finally, we want to work on a beta version for a more complicated decision support game, where there is much more underlying mathematics. Objective 1 and 3-1 is short term, 1 year. The other objectives are longer term, around 3-year research objectives. Thank you very much.
Hold the mic. Okay, so like 3rd or 4th time this slide has come up, and I've never showed it ever, so it's amazing what buying people drinks will do for you. Okay, so there is no theory for how you should take all the different models we have, very high resolution process models, socioeconomic models. There's no theory for how you combine those to help decision makers. None. That's what DEFRA just said, distilled down. There is no theory. So on the program, we thought we'd try and come up with some, and we did, and then we consulted with every scientist that came on, and we sort of refined it, and we kept going, and we came up with the framework. And the framework basically works like this. All of the models are useful. We'll use them all. Multiple models of every different high resolution thing, but they're slow. So we'll first build emulators or run them quickly if we can for those, to get the decision maker the space of landscapes that lead to outcomes that you like. So I have to brush over what outcomes that you like means, but it's certainly not a mathematician's job to define that. But the outcomes range from everything. So decisions that meet targets whilst not ruining other things and so forth. And then you have models that have socioeconomics in them, where you can change policy levers and so forth, and they lead to different land uses. And we have the theory for putting it all together, not to optimize, because that's crazy. We'll miss something off here and then we'll have optimized the wrong problem and you can bin everything that we did, but to give you every possible decision that would lead you to good outcomes that you like. And once we have that, we can display it, cluster it, show you common ways of getting to the same thing, show you decisions that lead to good things for biodiversity versus good things for other things. It's the kind of decision support that means the mathematician and the modelers don't make the decision, you do.
Extra brownie points for Danny for being on time.
Sorry, give me such a time.
Okay, so the aim of this project is to adapt and use mathematical tools from statistical physics to gain novel insights into the key determinants of landscape diversity and how it's affected by policy interventions. The key idea is that while landscapes are complex systems, perhaps the aggregated behavior of landscapes is simpler and can be predicted more robustly. And this is inspired by the lessons from statistical physics, which tells us that the aggregated behavior of a large assembly of molecules can be predicted robustly from the laws of probability without following the molecular collisions in great detail. And in my talk yesterday, I showed how this idea, when applied to natural communities, is able to explain and synthesize a wide variety of contrasting patterns in biodiversity in natural communities. And it does so by using essentially identifying the key ingredient that shapes the biodiversity of natural communities as being a constraint on space and a constraint on resources of the community as a whole. And the idea of this project is to build on that success and apply the same ideas of statistical physics to managed landscapes, where we anticipate that in addition to those environmental constraints that shape the diversity of natural communities, we will have to add socio-economical constraints to explain the diversity of managed landscapes. So we're going to apply this idea, test it using data at regional, national and even global scales to find out at what scales this statistical approach works and what are the key determinants of landscape diversity at each of those scales. And then in setting all that up, the eventual idea is to be able to then follow through the implications of policy interventions on landscape diversity through their effect on the constraints. And lastly, I would just mention that this whole approach is this is just to illustrate that we can. This model is so simple, one can represent the behavior of the model using cartoons. Look at my talk to see what this is. But there's the idea then is to. I think this fits into the enabling mode of governance that was talked by Matthew, because by construction it follows through policy interventions at the system level, no micromanagement, while recognizing, even celebrating the diversity of the system within that. So, okay.
Thanks, Rory.
Right, so how long have I got, Felix? Like minus how long? How much?
You're at minus
Minus is fine.
6 minutes.
Minus 6. Okay, I just.
Yeah, so do you want to just quickly...
Yeah, no, I've got a few I should do because I've asked for them. And we can think of this as our roadmap discussion, some of it. Okay, so this is one that relates to some of the data we heard about from the Woodland Trust actually, and perhaps also forest research. The idea here is you use theories of forest demography. This is essentially the number of trees of a given mass and how it varies with one parameter really, which is the ratio of mortality to growth. And what we find when we look at data we can get from the US or South America is a really amazing fit of this functional form, which is a viable distribution, to the data. And the one fitting parameter really tells you this ratio of mortality to growth for trees. What we'd like to do is to use data for the UK and do this, but also look for where the profile diverges from the equilibrium, because that really is the remaining carbon store in it. So imagine that you had a fit at the top and it came out here. The difference between these two would be a kind of measure of the carbon sink. Right, I've got to do two others for other people who were here for a long time but couldn't be here today. This is Carol Dallin from UCL. This is about using remote sensing data and AI techniques to get high resolution crop specific maps of harvested area and yield for use in assessments of food and land use. So this is I think this is a key thing. And there are lots of connections that we're just beginning to make. I mean, Duncan mentioned the digital environment we're making to the AI data usage thing. And the final one from Marcel van Ooyen from CH, who was here all the time but has had to go home, actually addresses a point that Pam brought up in a Skype call, very useful Skype call we had a couple of weeks ago, which relates to getting a better idea of the risk of drought mortality in forests under climate change and environmental variability in general. Uses a Bayesian approach, uses data from UK, Finland and Spain, and is kind of very much embedded in that idea of a risk analysis. Right, so one final slide. First of all, thanks for everyone for doing that. It was a bit of an experiment. The audience has been machine gunned, but I think it shows how much ideas have come out of this thing and how collaborative it's been. So I just wanted to highlight a few roadmap things that came out of our discussion yesterday, which were on these boards, and this leads a bit into the roadmap discussion. Also some of the things that were said in the talks with my particular spin on it. So these are longer term things, but they are kind of exciting. Felix mentioned this, universal scaling laws for landscape decisions. We spoke about James spoke about integral differential equations as that are used in ecology, whether they could use those more generally for human movement. Roddy spoke about Maxent, there are scale invariance type things. Really theoretical stuff. Mathematical theory of agent-based models that actually Stephen mentioned. I think it's going to be an ongoing thing. And bridging the gaps between agent-based models and economic optimization models. This relates a bit to a point that you made before, Duncan. Many of the models are actually essentially economic optimization ones, except the ones that are agent-based, and it feels like it's not clear how you join them up. We've spoken about inverse modeling to identify robust outcomes. This is the beginning of this is the agenda that Danny was talking about, which is we don't want to optimize a system that we don't know well, because we're definitely in the wrong place, and Peter said the same thing. We want to know the whole part of the phase space, if you like, of policy measures that might lead to a good place. So it's about resilience of the policy outcome to uncertainty. And then more generally, we've spoken about how do you reduce the dimensionality of complex models to make them tractable, more transparent, so people might actually believe them more for a particular problem, and whether you can do that with statistical emulators or other forms of dimension reduction. And I think that's it. Thanks so much.
We were thinking for the last advantage our higher level stakeholder decision makers, so that we possibly get Duncan and Steve to come up.
I'm afraid I'll have to leave at 4 o'clock sharp. I have to take a call.
Right, so we're going to talk to you then, if that's all right.
Do you want to say that?
Might be better if it wasn't me.
Would it be?
Might be better if it isn't me. So.
Right.
So what's that?
He's got a call from whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. This is about 8 minutes until then, I think.
Yeah, I think you might need to think about it.
Oh, right, okay, sorry. Sorry, I didn't thought that'd be enough time.
Who else we can?
We have Steve and Pam, possibly?
Yeah, don't get off the hook, you two. So we put chairs up here, is that the plan?
Yeah, sure. Does that sound sensible?